On June 15th, 2018, a frantic 911 call shattered the quiet of Greenville, Georgia. On the other end of the line was David Dawson, his voice shaky, words tumbling over each other in panic. He reported that his wife, Emily Dawson, had been shot outside their home. The urgency in his tone was undeniable, but beneath the surface of fear, something felt off. David told the dispatcher that he and Emily had been arguing earlier that evening, the kind of argument that couples have, he claimed. According to David, after the tension grew too much, he went back inside the house to cool off. Moments later, he heard two gunshots pierce the night. Rushing outside, he found Emily lying motionless on the ground. When first responders arrived, they found David near Emily's body, visibly distraught, his hands trembling. Emily was pronounced dead at the scene, the victim of what initially appeared to be a sudden, tragic act of violence. But as investigators began piecing together the details, questions started to surface. Why were there no signs of forced entry or struggle? Why did David's story shift slightly each time he repeated it? And why did the neighbors report hearing not just gunshots, but shouting long after David claimed he went inside? This wasn't just another tragic shooting. It was the beginning of a mystery filled with contradictions, hidden secrets, and the chilling possibility that the person who called for help might have known more than he was saying. What do you think happened that night? Was it a crime of passion, an accident, or something far more sinister? Stay with us as we unravel the layers of this case, where every detail matters and the truth may be buried deeper than anyone expected. When first responders arrived at the Dawson residence in Greenville, Georgia, they were met with a scene that raised more questions than answers. Emily Dawson was found slumped over in the driver's seat of her car, parked just a few feet from the front porch. Her body was eerily still, her head tilted unnaturally, and there was a chilling silence that seemed to hang in the air long after the chaos of the 911 call. In her non-dominant left hand, Emily was clutching a pink revolver, its polished surface smeared with faint traces of blood. The detail struck investigators immediately. Emily was known to be right-handed. Why would she be holding a weapon in her left hand? And more importantly, if she had fired the gun, why were there no signs of defensive wounds or powder burns that typically accompany close-range shootings? You're absolutely right to highlight this point. The two gunshot wounds to the head are a massive red flag and a key indicator that this was not a simple suicide. Let's break down why this is so significant. Physiological impossibility. A gunshot wound to the head, especially one that's immediately fatal or near fatal, typically causes massive trauma to the brain. This trauma often results in instant incapacitation. The person loses consciousness, their motor functions cease, and they physically can't perform complex actions like firing a second shot. It's not just about the pain, it's about the brain's ability to function. The second shot phenomenon, or lack thereof. While there are extremely rare cases where someone has survived a first headshot and been able to fire a second, these are outliers. They usually involve specific areas of the brain being hit or missed, and a degree of consciousness and motor control being retained. However, two shots to the head, particularly if they're close together and in vital areas, make this scenario highly improbable. It strains credulity to believe Emily could have intentionally inflicted a second wound. A clear sign of foul play. For investigators, this immediately screams homicide. It suggests an intentional act by another person. It points to a level of violence and determination that is rarely seen in suicides. It suggests someone wanted to ensure Emily was dead. In short, the presence of two gunshot wounds to the head isn't just unusual. It's a powerful piece of evidence that strongly suggests foul play. It's a detail that throws David Dawson's potential explanations, accident, suicide, into serious doubt and focuses the investigation squarely on the possibility of murder. The positioning of the gun, the trajectory of the bullets, and the lack of gunpowder residue on Emily's hands all hinted at something far more sinister than an accident or a tragic self-inflicted act. Crime scene analysts noted that there were no signs of struggle inside the vehicle, and Emily's seatbelt was still fastened, a small detail, but one that suggested she hadn't been expecting anything out of the ordinary when she got into her car. Investigators also noticed David Dawson's behavior. He was emotional, but his reactions seemed inconsistent, oscillating between frantic and eerily calm. When questioned about the pink revolver, David claimed it belonged to Emily, though friends and family later testified that Emily had a well-known fear of firearms and rarely handled guns. This wasn't just a tragic death. It was a puzzle, with each piece hinting at a story that didn't match David's account. Why was Emily holding a gun in her non-dominant hand? How could someone survive long enough to fire a second shot after the first fatal wound? And why did David's story seem to shift under even the slightest scrutiny? The answers would unravel a web of secrets, lies, and a chilling truth hidden beneath the surface of a seemingly ordinary marriage. When authorities arrived at the Dawson residence on June 15, 2018, they encountered a scene that initially suggested a tragic personal event. Emily Dawson was found in her car with a pink revolver resting in her non-dominant left hand and 2 gunshot wounds. At first glance, the circumstances led investigators to consider the possibility of a self-inflicted act based on the positioning of the weapon and the absence of immediate signs of a struggle. However, as the investigation progressed, details emerged that prompted further scrutiny. The fact that Emily had 2 gunshot wounds raised concerns. In similar cases, a single wound is more typical, making this detail stand out. Additionally, the revolver was found in Emily's non-dominant hand, which investigators noted as an unusual detail that warranted closer examination. While initial assessments considered the possibility of suicide, Emily's family and friends voiced strong doubts. They described Emily as a loving mother and a dedicated member of her community, someone who was optimistic, resilient, and deeply engaged in her personal and professional life. According to those closest to her, she had plans for the future and was committed to her family, especially her children. Her mother shared heartfelt concerns, saying Emily had so much to live for. This just doesn't make sense. Friends also highlighted Emily's discomfort with firearms, raising questions about the presence of the revolver. This detail, combined with their memories of her character, led them to believe that the situation warranted a more thorough investigation. Investigators took these concerns seriously, re-examining the evidence with fresh eyes. They reviewed forensic details, timelines, and witness accounts, including statements from David Dawson, Emily's husband, who had reported the incident. His account was carefully considered alongside the physical evidence, as investigators worked to understand the sequence of events that led to Emily's death. This case, which initially seemed straightforward, soon revealed complexities that required deeper analysis. The combination of forensic findings, family testimony, and investigative diligence helped shift the focus toward uncovering the full truth. The investigation continued with one guiding question: what really happened that night, and what will the evidence reveal? As investigators dug deeper, it became clear that every detail mattered in the search for answers. As investigators delved deeper into the circumstances surrounding Emily Dawson's tragic death, new revelations painted a more complex picture of her life behind closed doors. What initially appeared to be a sudden and tragic event was soon overshadowed by the intricate dynamics of Emily and David Dawson's troubled marriage. Interviews with friends and family revealed that David and Emily had been experiencing significant marital issues. Their relationship had grown increasingly strained in the months leading up to Emily's death, marked by frequent arguments and emotional distance. Tensions reportedly escalated when David discovered that Emily had been involved in an affair, a fact that he learned on the very day she died. This discovery added a new layer of emotional turmoil, raising questions about the state of mind and motivations of everyone involved. Friends close to Emily shared that she had been planning to leave David for some time. She had been quietly saving money, preparing for a fresh start, away from the stress and conflict that had defined their marriage in recent years. According to those who knew her best, Emily was determined to create a better life for herself and her children, and she had been taking steps to regain her independence. One friend recalled, Emily wasn't the type to make rash decisions. She was careful, thoughtful, and focused on building a future where she could be happy again. She had a plan. These revelations shifted the investigation's focus. The knowledge of David's discovery, combined with Emily's plans to leave, introduced potential motives and emotional triggers that could not be ignored. Investigators revisited the timeline of events, David's statements, and the physical evidence with fresh eyes, considering how these new insights might align or conflict with what had been initially reported. While the investigation continued, one thing became clear. Emily's death was not just a tragic event. It was the result of complex relationships, hidden tensions, and decisions made in moments of intense emotion. The search for the truth was far from over, and every new detail brought investigators one step closer to understanding what really happened that day. What role did these personal struggles play in the events leading up to Emily's death? And how do the pieces of this puzzle fit together to reveal the full story? As the case unfolded, it became evident that beneath the surface of a seemingly ordinary life was a story filled with secrets, heartbreak, and the relentless pursuit of answers. As the investigation into Emily Dawson's death continued, the autopsy results provided critical insights that shifted the case from a tragic possibility to a confirmed crime. The medical examiner officially ruled Emily's death a homicide, citing clear forensic evidence that contradicted any suggestion of self-infliction. One of the most significant findings was the presence of 2 gunshot wounds to Emily's head, an extremely rare occurrence in self-inflicted cases due to the immediate incapacitation caused by the first shot. This detail alone raised serious doubts, but the autopsy revealed even more inconsistencies. The trajectory of the bullets and the positioning of the wounds did not align with the scenario initially considered. Furthermore, the fact that the weapon was found in Emily's non-dominant left hand added another layer of suspicion, as forensic evidence indicated it was highly unlikely she could have fired the shots herself in that manner. The investigation's focus sharpened when it was discovered that no gunshot residue, GSR tests, were conducted on David Dawson, Emily's husband, and the first person on the scene. This omission was highly unusual in cases involving firearms, as GSR tests can help determine whether someone has recently discharged a weapon. The absence of this crucial forensic step left a gap in the early investigation, raising questions about how the initial scene was handled. Adding to the concerns, it was uncovered that the family had cleaned the car where Emily's body was found before forensic investigators could fully process the scene. This act, whether intentional or not, compromised potential evidence that could have been vital in reconstructing the events leading to Emily's death. Critical forensic traces, such as fingerprints, DNA, and blood spatter patterns, may have been disturbed or destroyed, making it more challenging to piece together the truth. Investigators grew increasingly suspicious as these details surfaced. Why was the crime scene cleaned so quickly? Why weren't standard forensic procedures like GSR testing followed? And how did these oversights affect the search for answers? With the autopsy confirming homicide, the case took a decisive turn. Investigators re-examined every detail, focusing on inconsistencies in David's account and the physical evidence left behind. The truth was buried beneath layers of mistakes, overlooked procedures, and unanswered questions, But with each discovery, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. As the investigation into Emily Dawson's death deepened, attention turned to the person who had been closest to both the victim and the scene, David Dawson. His behavior, from the moment he placed the 911 call to his subsequent interviews with law enforcement, became a focal point of scrutiny, raising critical questions about his role in the unfolding events. During the 911 call, David's tone was surprisingly composed. While some might interpret this as shock, trained dispatchers and investigators noted that his calm, almost detached demeanor seemed unusual given the gravity of the situation. His voice lacked the emotional intensity typically associated with someone who had just discovered a loved one fatally injured. There were no audible signs of distress, no sobbing, no sense of urgency beyond the words he spoke. This observation alone wasn't conclusive, as people react differently to trauma, but it was the first of many red flags. In subsequent interviews with investigators, David's demeanor remained inconsistent. At times, he displayed moments of sadness and frustration, but these emotional shifts often felt out of sync with the timeline of questioning. His answers varied, and his recounting events seemed rehearsed in some parts, vague in others. One of the most concerning aspects of David's statements was his description of the gun's position when he found Emily. In his initial account, he claimed the gun was in Emily's lap. Later, he changed his story, stating it was in her hand. In another version, he suggested it had fallen between the seat and the console. These inconsistencies were critical, as the precise location of the weapon could provide vital clues about whether the scene had been staged. Investigators also noted that David rarely asked typical questions that grieving spouses often do in such situations, such as, "Is she going to be okay?" or "What happened?" Instead, his focus seemed to shift quickly toward procedural details: what would happen next, what the police needed from him, without the raw, disoriented emotion usually seen in someone experiencing sudden loss. While none of these behaviors alone were definitive, when combined with the forensic evidence, the autopsy findings, and the inconsistencies in his narrative, they painted a picture of a man whose version of events didn't fully align with the facts. Why did David's story change over time? Was his calm demeanor a coping mechanism or a sign of something more? And how do his actions fit into the larger puzzle of what happened to Emily Dawson? As the investigation pressed on, David's behavior continued to be a critical piece of the case, raising questions not just about what he knew, but what he might have been hiding. After a lengthy investigation filled with twists, inconsistencies, and mounting evidence, David Dawson was indicted for murder in 2019. The case against him took years to come to trial, with proceedings finally beginning in 2023. By then, the story had gripped the local community. A tragic tale of a seemingly ordinary marriage unraveled by betrayal, loss, and the chilling possibility of foul play. The prosecution's case was built around three key pillars: motive, forensic evidence, and David's behavior. Motive. The prosecution argued that David's motive was rooted in Emily's affair, which he had discovered on the very day of her death. They painted a picture of a man overwhelmed by feelings of betrayal, anger, and the fear of losing control over a crumbling marriage. Testimonies from friends and family highlighted how Emily had been planning to leave David, secretly saving money for a fresh start. The prosecution suggested that this looming separation and the emotional fallout from the affair created a volatile situation that ultimately led to Emily's death. Forensic evidence. The autopsy results were critical. The fact that Emily was shot twice in the head, coupled with the discovery of the gun in her non-dominant left hand, contradicted any theory of a self-inflicted wound. Forensic experts testified about the improbability of someone firing 2 shots in a suicide scenario, especially with such precise placement. Additionally, the absence of gunshot residue, GSR, tests on David was highlighted, not as direct evidence, but as a missed opportunity that conveniently left a gap in the investigation. The fact that the car had been cleaned shortly after Emily's death also raised suspicions, as potential evidence could have been compromised. David's behavior. The prosecution scrutinized David's calm demeanor during the 911 call and his inconsistent statements during police interviews. They argued that his emotional responses seemed rehearsed, and his changing account of where the gun was found suggested attempts to manipulate the narrative. However, the defense mounted a strong counterargument, focusing on the lack of direct physical evidence tying David to the crime. No direct evidence. The defense emphasized that there were no eyewitnesses, no surveillance footage, and no forensic evidence, like fingerprints on the weapon, that conclusively proved David had pulled the trigger. They argued that while the prosecution's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence and speculative motives, there was no definitive proof linking David to Emily's death. Emotional struggles. To introduce doubt, the defense suggested that Emily's emotional struggles, stemming from personal and marital issues, could have contributed to a tragic decision. They presented witnesses who spoke about Emily's stress, the pressures she faced, and the emotional toll of her complicated personal life. The defense argued that, despite the unusual forensic details, the possibility of suicide could not be entirely ruled out. The trial captivated the courtroom, with emotional testimonies from Emily's family, intense cross-examinations, and forensic experts presenting detailed analyses. The jury listened closely, weighing the emotional undercurrents against the hard facts. Was David Dawson a grieving husband caught in a tragic situation, or was he hiding the truth about what really happened to Emily? As the trial reached its conclusion, one thing was clear. The search for justice was as complex as the case itself, leaving the jury with the difficult task of separating fact from doubt in a story filled with heartbreak, betrayal, and unanswered questions. Trust trial outcome. After weeks of emotional testimony, forensic evidence, and gripping courtroom drama, the jury delivered their verdict. David Dawson was found guilty of the murder of Emily Dawson. The verdict was met with a heavy silence in the courtroom, a moment that seemed to freeze time for everyone involved. The jurors had deliberated meticulously, weighing the circumstantial evidence, the inconsistencies in David's story, and the forensic details that painted a chilling picture of what likely happened on that fateful night. David showed little visible reaction as the verdict was read, maintaining the same composed demeanor he had displayed throughout the trial. However, for those who had followed the case closely, this lack of emotion only deepened the contrast between his calm exterior and the gravity of the crime he had been convicted of. The judge sentenced David to 99 years in prison with the possibility of parole eligibility after 15 years. The sentence reflected not just the severity of the crime, but also the lasting impact it had on Emily's family, her friends, and the broader community. Family impact. Perhaps one of the most heartbreaking elements of the case was the emotional toll it took on Emily's family, especially her mother, Sarah Williams. In the early days following Emily's death, Sarah had stood by David, believing in his innocence and supporting his version of events. Their shared grief created a bond that, for a time, shielded Sarah from the growing suspicions surrounding David's involvement. However, as the trial unfolded, Sarah was faced with evidence that she could no longer ignore. The forensic reports, the inconsistencies in David's accounts, and the overwhelming details presented in court shattered the narrative she had clung to in her grief. Her heartbreak was compounded by the realization that the man she had trusted, her son-in-law, had played a role in her daughter's death. In a statement after the verdict, Sarah said with tears in her eyes, "I wanted to believe the best, but the truth was right in front of me. Emily deserved justice, and today She got it. The case also had a profound impact on Emily's children, who were caught in the unimaginable position of losing both parents, one to a tragic death and the other to a prison sentence. Family members stepped in to provide care and support, but the emotional scars of such a traumatic loss would linger. Counseling and community support became critical in helping them navigate the complex grief and confusion surrounding their family's story. For both the Dawson and Williams families, the trial marked not just the end of a legal battle, but the beginning of a long journey toward healing. The verdict brought justice, but it couldn't erase the pain, the betrayal, or the lingering question of why. This case serves as a haunting reminder of how fragile the line can be between the people we trust and the truths we refuse to see. It highlights the devastating ripple effects of violence, not just for the victim, but for everyone left behind to pick up the pieces. What would justice mean to you in a situation like this? Can closure ever truly be found when the people we love become the source of our deepest heartbreak? Emily's story is a testament to the importance of seeking truth, even when it's painful, and the enduring strength of those left behind to carry on her memory.